It all began with a call to the number 112. On the 22nd of June, 2022 at 16:47, a woman's voice sounded on the line, even almost mechanical, without a single trembling note. It belonged to Annalise Vermeulen, and she reported that her 4-year-old son, Leo, had just disappeared. In her words, there was neither panic nor screams or tears, only a detached, ice-cold statement of facts, as if she was speaking not about her own child, but about something distant, alien. For the dispatcher who took the call, it was work. He asked the usual questions, filled out the form. In the police report, this call condensed into a few sober lines. Caller Annalise Vermeulen, address Kirkinlen. Aldenal, a quiet, almost pastoral suburb of the Belgian city of Leuven, a place where well-kept brick houses are nestled in greenery and tragedies apparently only happen in the news. Subject of the report, the disappearance of Leo Vermeulen, who was only 4 years old. The story Annalise told sounded painfully familiar. Her son had been playing in the garden behind the house. She had only been distracted for a few minutes to attend to household chores. And when she looked out the window, he was no longer there. She had searched the entire property, called his name, checked every room, empty. The garden gate was locked. No stranger in the yard. The boy had simply vanished on the grounds of his own home in the place that seemed the safest in the world. In such cases, the protocol is always the same. The nearest patrol car is immediately dispatched to the scene. As the officers drove through the impeccably clean streets of Odendaal, they were probably preparing for the standard procedure, calming a crying mother, methodically searching the house and its surroundings. Most of the time, such stories end happily. The child is found in a closet at the neighbor's house or in a playhouse in the garden. The patrol car turned into Kasikan and stopped in front of a modern country house with panoramic windows and a perfect lawn. This house looked like something out of a magazine, the embodiment of a family dream. The police officers went to the door behind which they assumed a grief-stricken family awaited them. They did not yet suspect that the perfect facade of this house concealed not only a tragedy, but a soul-devouring emptiness, and that the boy they were supposed to be looking for had in reality been gone for a long time. When the officers entered, they were greeted by Annalise and her husband Bastien Vermeulen, a beautiful, successful couple as if sprung from a glossy magazine. He is sought-after architect with an impeccable reputation. She, a popular lifestyle blogger whose online presence was a hymn to aesthetics and perfection. Even at this moment, as they recounted the details of their son's disappearance, they maintained an astonishing composure. Their grief was quiet, restrained, almost cultivated. The house itself was a continuation of their image. Impeccable cleanliness, expensive minimalist furniture, decor thought out to the smallest detail. In the air hung the delicate scent of an exclusive room perfume. Everything was in its place. Everything gleamed, and it was precisely this sterility that first struck the experienced police officers. In a house where a 4-year-old boy was supposed to be growing up, there was no trace of his presence. No scattered toys on the floor, no colorful drawings on the refrigerator, no small fingerprints on the glass surfaces. The Voyan family's living space looked like a showroom where no one actually lived. While one team of police officers began to comb the grounds, another dedicated itself to the standard procedure, gathering information about the family. The examination of Annalise's social networks was like diving into a dream world. Here she was on vacation in Bali with her husband. There at the opening of a trendy gallery, here she presented a new designer dress against the backdrop of her immaculate interior. Thousands of photos documenting every step of their successful, beautiful life. In her posts, she often wrote about motherhood, about small joys and great responsibility. But her words were abstract, like quotes from psychology books. The investigators scrolled through her feed further and further back in time, searching for photos of Leo. And at this point, something was wrong. There were pictures of the newborn touching shots from his first birthday celebration, and then nothing, emptiness. The last photo of the boy had been published 3 years ago. After that, he seemed to have disappeared from the public life of his mother, who showcased every one of her breakfasts. When asked directly about it, Annalise replied calmly and confidently, as if she had prepared the answer. She explained that she and her husband had made a principled decision to protect their son's private life from public view. In theory, this sounded noble and right. But for the investigators standing in the middle of this cold, lifeless house, this explanation sounded like an alarm signal. From that moment on, they were no longer just looking for a missing boy. They began to investigate the lives of his parents. While one team of investigators delved into the digital world of the family, another worked with their reality, with their version of the events of that day. Annalise and Bastian described it almost word for word like two actors who had perfectly rehearsed their roles. Their narrative was simple in every detail, which only raised more questions. According to protocol, Annalise claimed Leo was playing in the garden at the sandbox. I was nearby on the terrace. I went into the house for literally 10 minutes to put on the kettle and answer a work email. When I came back, he was gone. Bastian, who was allegedly working in his study on the second floor at the time, fully confirmed her words. He added an important detail. Our property is completely fenced. The garden gate is always secured with an electronic lock. A stranger cannot just get in here. We place great importance on security. On paper, everything looked logical. The classic scenario of a kidnapping where the perpetrator took advantage of a parent's moment of inattention. The police immediately began to act on the basis of this version. The area around the house was carefully combed. Every bush, every corner of the garden inspected. Dog handlers with scent dogs were brought in, the best tool in the search for missing persons. And here the investigation encountered the first inexplicable oddity. The dogs confidently picked up the boy's scent at the sandbox, tracked it across the lawn to the house's terrace, and then nothing. The trail ended. It led neither to the fence nor to the gate, nor in any direction beyond the property. The animals circled in one spot, confused, as if the boy had ascended into the air right at the threshold of his own home. At the same time, forensic technicians completed the examination of the property boundary. Their conclusion was unambiguous and cold as steel. There was no damage to the high fence on the ground, no foreign tracks. The electronic lock on the gate showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing, absolutely nothing, indicated that someone had entered the property from outside. The version of a kidnapper who had climbed over the fence and taken the boy collapsed before their eyes. It became obvious that if something had happened to Leo, it must have happened within these perfect walls and this immaculate garden. When the on-site search reached a dead end, the focus of the investigation shifted. If the answer was not on the surface, they had to search deeper into the lives of the Vermeulen family themselves. The detectives began with the most obvious, questioning the neighbors. And here the story became even stranger. People who had lived next door to the couple for years described them as polite but reserved. Everyone saw their expensive cars, the well-kept garden, the impeccable style. But when asked about the boy, most shrugged. Someone vaguely remembered seeing Annalise with a stroller a few years ago, but nothing more. The 4-year-old Leo was a ghost to them, an invisible figure in his own neighborhood. In parallel, analysts began a detailed examination of the couple's financial life. Routine, meticulous work followed, requesting bank statements, analyzing credit card transactions, checking invoices. The investigators were looking for clues, large cash withdrawals, unusual purchases, any financial anomalies that might indicate preparations for flight, blackmail, or the payment of ransom. They expected to find all sorts of things, but what they discovered fit none of the standard scenarios. The bank statements told a story of prosperity. Money was spent on designer clothes, expensive restaurants, travel, and art objects. The financial flow accurately reflected the ideal life Annalise showcased in her blog. But in this flow of money there was a deafening void. In the past 3 years, there were practically no expenses on the family's accounts that could be associated with a child. No bills from toy stores, no bills from pediatric clinics, no payments for developmental courses or clothing that a boy his age would constantly outgrow. This was no longer just strange. This was impossible. Annalise continued to write about the joys of motherhood in her posts, but her bank account screamed the opposite. The financial documents, the most honest and impartial witnesses, showed that there was no place in this family's life for the needs and desires of a small person. This was the first real material piece of evidence. No assumption, no feeling, but a cold documented fact. From that moment on, the investigation of a missing person case definitively turned into an investigation against the parents. Now that the financial records confirmed what the investigators had already suspected, the cold logic of the investigation solidified into the only possible conclusion. If no one from outside had entered the property and the boy had not left it, then only 2 people on the planet could provide the answer to what had happened to him, his parents. The circle closed around Annalise and Bastian Vermeulen. From that point on, every breath they took, every word, and every gesture was scrutinized under a microscope. They were repeatedly summoned for interrogations individually and together. Experienced detectives varied their tactics. They applied pressure, showed sympathy, caught them in contradictions. But the wall the couple had built was impenetrable. Their statements matched down to the last comma. They repeated their story calmly and methodically without losing composure or showing emotion, except for a restrained sadness. They were a perfect team, providing each other with an ironclad alibi. At the time of the disappearance, both were in the house, but in different parts, and no one had seen anything suspicious. The totality of the evidence, the sterile house, the lack of traces of the child's life, the strange financial reports, the neighbors' statements, all painted a very bleak picture. In the interrogation rooms, there was a heavy tension. The investigators were practically certain that they were facing people who knew far more than they were saying. But certainty is not proof. Without a body, without a confession, without direct evidence linking the parents to a crime, all these suspicions remain just a theory. Precisely for this reason, something seemingly paradoxical happened in the official case files. Although the entire investigation focused on them, Anneliese and Bastien Vermeulen did not receive the status of suspects. Legally, they were listed as key witnesses in the case. This formality tied the police's hands, preventing the use of the full arsenal of investigative measures. At the same time, however, it forced them to act even more resolutely. It became clear that the only way to break through this wall of silence was to obtain a search warrant for their perfect house. After obtaining the search warrant, the investigative team returned to Carrick-Hanlon. This time, they were not guests, but masters of the situation with the right to look into every corner, to break open every floorboard. Their goal was not a superficial inspection, but a total deconstruction of the perfect facade the Voyans had erected. And they began at the most logical place in the children's room. Leo's room, located on the second floor, was the embodiment of every interior designer's dream, decorated in calm pastel tones with expensive Scandinavian furniture and educational toys perfectly arranged on the shelves. Everything was thought out, everything harmonized. But it was precisely this immaculateness that became a deafening piece of evidence for the forensic technicians. In the room where a 4-year-old boy was supposed to live, play, and discover the world, life itself was missing. The experts methodically documented the details that transformed this idyllic picture into a crime scene. Firstly, the toys. They had not a single scratch, not the slightest sign of wear. The books on the shelves stood with untouched, crisp spines. Secondly, the clothes in the closet. They were neatly folded in stacks, but on closer inspection, it turned out that most of them were designed for a 2-year-old child, not a 4-year-old. There were no recently purchased items. And finally, the most important thing, the prints. The specialists treated all surfaces, and the results were shocking. In the room, there were numerous adult prints belonging to Anneliese. The children's prints, traces of small, curious hands, were practically non-existent. This was not just an oversight. It was proof. This room was not a home for Leo, but a backdrop, a carefully staged showcase for a non-existent, happy family life. In an official expert report, the dry but damning sentence would later appear. The condition of the room and the objects within it do not correspond to the behavioral activity characteristic of a child of this age. The room bears the hallmarks of a staged and not an inhabited room. The children's room was a deception. This meant that somewhere in this perfect house, behind one of its immaculate walls, another a real room had to be hidden, and the investigators were determined to find it. At the same time, Anneliese and Bastien continued their act, while forensic technicians meticulously dismantled the house in public. They were the grief-stricken parents. Anneliese even found the strength to publish a heartbreaking post on her blog with the last available photo of Leo, the one taken 3 years earlier. She wrote of the emptiness in the house, of the unbearable silence, and begged anyone who might know something to help them bring back their little sunshine. This post garnered thousands of sympathetic comments and was shared countless times. But behind the closed doors of the interrogation rooms where they continued to be summoned, the image of the united and grieving couple began to crack. Initially, these were small, almost imperceptible deviations. When asked separately what Leo had eaten for breakfast on the day of his disappearance, Anneliese confidently replied, "Oatmeal with berries, his favorite breakfast." Bastien, on the other hand, said without batting an eyelid, "Yogurt." He always ate yogurt in the morning, a minor detail that could be blamed on stress, but such trivialities accumulated. Then the contradictions became more serious. The detectives, inquired about the boy's health in the preceding days. Anneliese mentioned he had been somewhat lethargic, perhaps catching a cold. Bastian, however, described his son as perfectly healthy and full of energy in the same interrogation in the next room. Their versions of that fateful day also differed in details. The exact time he played in the garden, with which toys, what they planned to do after lunch. They were not telling the same story with slight variations, but two entirely different parallel realities. For experienced investigators, this was a signal. People who have experienced a shared trauma may be confused in their emotions, but the key facts of their shared life, especially the most recent ones, usually align. Here, however, it seemed as if the spouses were not only lying, but improvising, spontaneously, each inventing their own version of a non-existent past. These contradictions recorded in the protocols became the legal basis the investigators needed. They proved that the witnesses' statements were unreliable, and this made it possible to request permission from the court for a much deeper intrusion into their privacy, access to their mobile phone data, and the GPS tracker of their family car. When the analysts gained access to the couple's digital footprints, they first immersed themselves in the routine of their lives. Reconstructed from geolocation data, the picture that emerged was predictably mundane and entirely consistent with their image. Every weekday, the GPS tracker in Bastian's car dutifully traced the same route from their house on Carrick-in-Laon to the parking lot of his architectural firm in the center of Leven and back again in the evening. Anneliese's phone data showed her movements between the house, an elite gym, the farmer's market, and boutiques in the city center. Everything was correct, regulated, and boring. Weeks, months, always the same routes, precisely measured to the kilometer. The specialists sifted through hundreds of these traces, looking for every deviation, every unplanned visit that could be a clue. And amidst this monotonous stream of data, they stumbled upon a single entry that immediately made them forget everything else. It was a single trip, 1 week before analysis called the emergency number 112, a trip that neither Sheen nor Bastian had ever mentioned in interrogations. Digital forensic experts reconstructed this route meter by meter. On the 16th of June 2022, at 2:11 in the morning, the family car left their driveway. At this time, all of Oudandal was asleep, the streets completely empty. The car did not drive towards the city, but south in the opposite direction to a large forest area, the Heather Boss, a popular place for walks and picnics, but not at 2 in the morning. The vehicle drove about 10 kilometers, turned off the paved road onto a dirt track, penetrated deeper into the forest, and stopped at a point far from the official paths and parking lots. The data showed that the car stood there motionless for exactly 28 minutes. Then it turned around and returned home by the same route, pulling into the driveway at 3:40, long before sunrise. This nocturnal excursion was the only anomaly in their impeccably planned lives for many months. It was hidden, illogical, and took place at the darkest time of night. And most importantly, it happened exactly 6 days before the parents reported their son's disappearance. The investigators no longer had any doubts. Whatever had happened to Leo, the solution awaited there at that specific point on the map in the middle of the nocturnal forest. The search for the boy now had precise GPS coordinates, and the investigative team immediately set off there, prepared for the worst. While one part of this drama unfolded in the silence of the forest, in the quiet of the officers, another team continued its no less important work. They were looking for traces not in the earth but in bites of information, trying to reconstruct Leo Muan's life based on his digital footprint. And what they found resembled the story of a ghost on paper in government databases. The boy existed. He had a birth certificate issued in May 2018. He was assigned a social security number. He was a Belgian citizen, a real person with official status. But as soon as one dug deeper, this image began to fade, to crumble, and to dissolve into nothing. The first alarm signal was the medical records. Detectives discovered that Leo was born with a severe congenital facial defect, a rare genetic condition. In his first months of life, he was regularly presented to doctors. There were specialist consultations, records of prescribed treatments, and then after he turned 1 year old, absolute deafening silence. Not a single visit to the pediatrician, not a single age-appropriate vaccination, Not a single entry in his medical record for the past 3 years. From the perspective of the Belgian healthcare system, Leeuwen had ceased to exist. This conclusion was fully confirmed by the financial analysis, which was now conducted with particular care. Experts not only noted the absence of expenses for toys or clothing, they created a statistical model of the expenses of a typical Belgian family with a child of that age and compared it with the Vermeulen's expenses. The discrepancy was colossal. Absolutely nothing in their budget was allocated for what would have been necessary for the life and development of a small person. They spent thousands of euros on themselves, but not a single cent on doctors, medication, or the special care that, according to the original diagnosis, was vital for their son. They were not raising him. They were simply keeping him like an object hidden from the eyes of others. And amidst thousands of lines on bank statements filled with the names of fashion brands and expensive restaurants, analysts stumbled upon a single transaction so out of place that they initially thought it was an error. On the 16th of June 2022, on precisely the day Bastien made his nocturnal trip into the forest, an online purchase was paid for with their credit card. It was neither a designer handbag nor a work of art. It was a powerful industrial-grade electric meat grinder, a heavy, bulky stainless steel appliance capable of processing dozens of kg. Absurd item for a family of minimalist athletes who eat in restaurants. But for people who needed to dispose of evidence, this was a purchase full of ominous, monstrous meaning. By this point, an almost complete picture had emerged in the hands of the investigators. Their report now stated, "There is irrefutable evidence of the complete social and medical isolation of the minor by the parents." The purchase of equipment potentially usable for the elimination of crime scene traces was identified on the same day as an unexplained trip to a forested area. Now everything depended on exactly what the search team would find beneath the layer of her damp earth in the hevela unfolded in the silence of the forest. In the offices, the investigators worked through all possible versions and finally arrived at the only close relative who could shed light on the family's secret life. Anneliese's mother, an older, cultivated woman who received them with that mixture of fear and suppressed grief that betrayed she had long feared something. And her first words in the interrogation shifted the entire focus of the investigation for a moment. "My daughter," she said in a soft, broken voice. She was never really ready to be a mother. For her, it was like another project that had to be perfect, and when it wasn't perfect, she just didn't know what to do. This sentence opened up a new, terrible possibility. Perhaps Bastien was innocent. Perhaps it was the tragedy of a single woman who couldn't cope with postpartum depression, worsened by her son's illness and her own pathological perfectionism. The grandmother told a story that fully supported this version. Initially, she was overjoyed when her grandson was born, but almost immediately, she noticed the cold distance in her daughter's and son-in-law's behavior after the doctors had given the diagnosis. They spoke of Leo not as a beloved child, but as a problem that needs to be solved. Then she was methodically excluded. First, there were polite cancellations of meetings. "Mom, Leo is sleeping poorly today. Let's do it another time. He has a weak immune system. Doctors advise against contact. We are very tired. We just want to spend the weekend as a family of 3. Initially, she believed them, understood, sympathized. But the months passed, and the excuses never ended. Her attempts to visit, bring gifts, even see her grandson for 5 minutes were met with a wall of silence. Finally, contact ceased altogether. The last time she had seen Leo was when he was a little over 1 year old. This version sounded very convincing. It explained both the social isolation and the lack of medical care. The investigators were already beginning to consider a scenario in which Anneliese had done something terrible alone, and Bastien might only have been covering for her to save the family. To confirm the woman's words, she was asked to provide her phone for examination of correspondence with her daughter. And here, in the cold light of the smartphone screen, the version of a single mother's tragedy collapsed and shattered into 1,000 digital fragments. The messages were indeed there. Dozens of messages from the grandmother with pleas for a meeting and dozens of replies. But it wasn't only Anneliese who replied with the same regularity, with the same cold politeness. Bastien also wrote to her. His messages were even shorter and more categorical. "We are busy, not now. We'll get back to you when it suits." It became absolutely clear that this was not the spontaneous reaction of an exhausted woman. It was their common, coordinated, and cold-blooded policy. They acted as a single, well-oiled mechanism, cutting off the only person in Leo's life who could have raised the alarm. The red herring that could have shared the blame closed, only cementing them even more firmly as a unit. Now that it was proven they had acted as a team, the find in the Heavily boss ceased to be merely a piece of evidence. It became the final act of their shared monstrous plan. The unity with which Annalise and Bastian shielded their son from the outside world prompted investigators to dig deeper. It wasn't just about understanding the chronology of events, but the very nature of their connection. Who were these people before they became parents? What ideal life were they so desperately trying to protect? For this, the detectives turned to their past, interviewing childhood friends, college classmates, and former colleagues. And from these scattered memories, a portrait emerged of a couple obsessed with a single idea: the creation of a flawless image. Their story began like a romantic film. He, a brilliant architecture student with great hopes. She, a radiant, stylish young woman from the art faculty. They found each other based on their shared pursuit of perfection. From the very beginning, their life was not just everyday existence, but a carefully orchestrated performance. Every element was thought out, from the fashion brands and the choice of restaurant for dinner to their circle of friends, and the photos on the then-emerging social networks. Acquaintances described them as a power couple, a pair that did everything right. Their apartment resembled a gallery, their vacation, a photo shoot for a fashion magazine. They did not live. They curated their lives. Pregnancy and the expectation of a child became the logical continuation of this project. For them, it was less a step into parenthood than the final brushstroke in the picture of the perfect family. In conversations with friends, they did not discuss fears and hopes, but the design of the nursery, the brand of the stroller, and how stylish their family portraits would look. The child was not yet born, and already a role had been assigned to it in their flawless script. And then the script went wrong. The birth of Leo and the subsequent diagnosis were not a tragedy for them, but an image disaster. A child with a congenital facial defect did not fit into their precisely calibrated aesthetic. He was a flaw, a blemish in their perfect work, and the reaction was swift. Acquaintances recalled how the Voyans almost abruptly broke off all social contacts after the birth of their son. They no longer invited guests, and at rare meetings outside the home, they answered questions about Leo evasively and quickly changed the subject. They did not try to fight for his health. They began the fight to maintain their facade. Step by step, the investigators analyzed this information and came to the only possible conclusion about the motive. Here there was no sudden outburst of rage or postpartum depression in the classical sense. It was the cold, rational decision of two pathological narcissists in the files. Their motive was dryly and unmercifully formulated. The act was committed out of rejection of the child's physical defects and the desire to maintain a socially accepted image of a successful and aesthetically flawless family. For them, Leo was not a son, but a flawed detail of their grand project. And like any flawed detail, he was first hidden and then decided to be disposed of. Now, with a clear understanding of the motive, the police were only waiting for one thing: the physical confirmation of exactly how this disposal ended. And all eyes turned to the search team in the forest. Armed with a complete understanding of the motive, the investigators summoned Annalise and Bastian for another interrogation. But this time, it was no longer a conversation or information gathering. It was a direct confrontation. In the sterile interrogation room, the air was electric. The couple entered with the same mask of restrained grief, but their act no longer deceived anyone. The lead investigator delivered the first blow. He did not beat around the bush, but silently placed a printout on the table. On the sheet was a satellite image of the Hevelos forest area with their route of their night drive marked with a red line. Date, time, exact coordinates of the stop. June 16th, 11 at night, the detective said in a calm, cold voice. Could you please explain what you were doing at that time in that place? For a moment, panic flashed across Bastian's face, but he quickly composed himself. He tried to joke, saying he sometimes loved night drives to clear his head. Annalise supported him, adding that they just wanted to be alone in nature. Their explanation sounded just as false as everything else. Then the detective delivered the second blow. Another printout landed on the table, a screenshot of an order from an online shop, the photo of a shiny industrial meat grinder. The order was placed on the afternoon of June 16th. Delivered the next day, the investigator continued without changing his tone. A rather unusual hobby for an architect, don't you think? At that moment, something broke. Bastian's self-confidence was gone. He began to murmur something incoherently about culinary experiments, about wanting to try making homemade sausages for a long time. Annalise remained silent, clutching the armrests of the chair, her face turning ashen. Their wall of lies, which they had built for so long and so carefully, began to crumble under the weight of irrefutable facts. The detective paused to let them feel the full gravity of the moment, preparing to ask the crucial question, but he did not get to it. Bastian, realizing the game was over, broke the silence. "I want to call my lawyer," he said in a hoarse-choked voice. It was not a request. It was a demand. And this sentence became the formal point of no return. Their status as witnesses was gone. Cooperation with the investigators ended. The legal battle for their own survival had begun. The demand for a lawyer was the signal for the police. The wall of silence that the couple had erected was now reinforced by legal counsel, and it was no longer possible to break through it with words. This meant that the only way to get to the truth remained their house, this immaculate mausoleum that had to contain the solution. The investigation team returned to Karakinlan with a new crystal-clear task to find what was hidden. They were looking for an anomaly, a blemish in perfection, a crack in the ideal surface. The search had already lasted several hours. Every closet was opened, every drawer pulled out. But the house seemed built to hide nothing, and just when the search seemed hopeless, one of the most experienced detectives, methodically examining the spacious walk-in closet on the second floor, noticed a detail that had been overlooked during the first inspection. One of the panels clad in expensive wood had a barely perceptible gap, differing from the others by a fraction of a millimeter. It had neither a handle nor a lock. But when the forensic technician pressed it at a certain point, a soft click sounded, and the panel slid gently aside, revealing impenetrable darkness. Behind the false wall was no hiding place or safe. There was a narrow, steep staircase leading to the attic. As soon as the hatch opened, a heavy, stuffy air hit them. It was the smell of abandonment, a mixture of dust, household chemicals, and something else. A barely perceptible sour smell of an uninhabited room where a person had stayed too long. Upstairs, the investigators found themselves in a small windowless room, its walls clad with soundproofing panels. What they saw inside was the physical embodiment of all the horror they had suspected. It was a prison. On the floor lay a bare, dirty mattress. In the corner stood a plastic bucket. The only objects reminiscent of childhood were a few faded building blocks and an old rubber ball. On the inside of the door, at a small boy's eye level, deep scratches were visible. Traces of desperate attempts to get out. This room was the exact opposite of the ideal nursery one floor below. That one was a backdrop for the eyes of others. This one was Leo's reality. The forensic technicians immediately began their work. They took samples from all surfaces, and the results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The numerous DNA traces found on the mattress, the walls, and even on the meager toys all belonged exclusively to Leo Voyan. This was irrefutable material evidence. They had not only hidden their son from society, they had held him captive for years in a soundproof chamber just meters from their luxurious bedroom. The question was no longer whether they were hiding something terrible. The question was where they had taken the end result of their cruelty. The discovery in the attic was the battering ram that finally broke through the couple's defense. It is one thing to deny circumstantial evidence like GPS data, and quite another to explain the existence of a soundproof prison in one's own home. When the results of the DNA analysis were communicated to Annalise and Bastian's lawyers, their defense strategy based on complete denial crumbled to dust. And in this new reality, their seemingly strong alliance did not last even one day. Bastian was the first to collapse. More precisely, he did not collapse emotionally, but made a cold, calculated decision. One day, after the discovery of the secret room, his lawyer contacted the public prosecutor's office. The message was short and businesslike. His client was willing to cooperate with the investigators. He was ready to give a full statement about what had happened to Leo in exchange for a possible reduction in sentence. Their pact of silence was broken. In the struggle for survival, it was now every man for himself. The meeting was immediately arranged. Bastian sat in the same interrogation room But now he was a completely different person. The arrogance was gone. The mask of grief had fallen. All that remained was a tired, empty man pragmatically giving up his positions. In his words, there was no remorse, no regret, only facts. He did not tell a long story, but simply asked for a map. A detailed map of the heavily boss forest area was spread before him. He looked at it for a few seconds, and then silently tapped an inconspicuous point away from all paths with his finger. It was exactly the place where his car had stopped that night. "He is here," Bastian said softly. Then he took a pen and circled 2 more places on the map. A garbage container in a supermarket parking lot in a neighboring town, and a strip of forest along a highway. There, he said, they had disposed of other things. The boy's clothes, the packaging remnants of the purchased equipment, and a child's blanket. He revealed everything. Every element of their monstrous plan was now marked on the map. The police were no longer looking for a ghost in the forest. They drove off to retrieve a piece of evidence. Bastian's statement triggered the last darkest phase of the investigation, the reconstruction. Now with a confession, the results of the expert reports, and the terrible discoveries made on his tip, the investigation could finally piece together a complete and monstrous chronology of the last days in Leo's life. It all began on June 15th, 2022. On that day, the boy's behavior became the last straw for the parents. Perhaps it was the loud, incessant crying from the attic that disturbed their perfect silence and threatened to attract attention. At some point, one of them, Anneliese or Bastian, the investigators could never determine who exactly went up to his prison room. And there, in that stuffy darkness, Leo was struck on the head with a blunt object. Help was not called. He was simply left alone to die. That same night, in the sterile white bathroom of their designer house, they began to hide what they had done. With the equipment purchased the day before, they methodically destroyed the traces. Their goal was not only to get rid of the body, but also to make it impossible to determine the exact cause of death. The investigation would later find microscopic traces of blood and aggressive cleaning agents deep in the tile grout, the only thing they had not been able to wash away. The following night, on June 16th, Bastian got into the car and began his route, which would later be tracked by GPS. He took the remains to the Heather Lebow's forest and threw the clothes, blanket, and other items related to his son into garbage containers along the way. And 6 days later, when all traces, as they believed, had been eliminated, Anneliese Vermeulen picked up the phone and, with that same steady, emotionless voice, reported the disappearance to emergency number 112. The pathologist's report, based on the remains found in the forest, put a definitive, irrefutable end to this case. The report stated dryly, "Cause of death is a severe life-threatening craniocerebral trauma. The subsequent actions on the body were performed after death to cover up the crime." The trial of Anneliese and Bastian Vermeulen began in September 2023 and immediately attracted the attention of all Belgium. They entered the courtroom no longer as a united team, but as 2 irreconcilable enemies. Their alliance, built on a common crime, had finally broken, and now each of them tried to save themselves by shifting the main blame onto the other. Bastian's lawyers built the defense on the premise that Anneliese had delivered the fatal blow in a fit of passion, and he, as a loving husband, had only tried to help her erase the traces of the tragedy. Anneliese, in turn, claimed the opposite through her defenders. According to her version, it was Bastian who, annoyed by the crying, had gone up to the attic, while she had not known what had happened to her son until the last moment, and had only agreed to participate in the cover-up under pressure from her husband. They argued about who delivered the blow, who bought the equipment, and who first suggested faking an abduction. This dispute between 2 people utterly devoid of remorse seemed grotesque and repulsive. However, for the prosecution and the court, these details were no longer crucial. The prosecutor emphasized in his plea that this was not the crime of one person helped by another. It was a joint, cold-blooded, and methodical act that extended over time. Their main crime was not even the murder itself, but the years of inhumane isolation to which they had condemned their own son. They had deprived him not only of his life, but also of his childhood, his care, and his basic human warmth. The verdict was not long in coming. The court did not bother to find out whose hand had delivered the fatal blow and found both equally guilty. The final verdict stated, "The court finds Anneliese and Bastian Vermeulen guilty of murder committed with particular cruelty by omission and infliction of injuries, as well as the subsequent cover-up of the act." The sentence, life imprisonment for both. As the judge read these words, Not a muscle twitched in their faces. They heard their sentence with the same cold, detached expression with which they had lived and committed their crime. As the courtroom doors closed behind Anneliese and Bastian Vermeulen, a legal conclusion was reached in this story. Justice had prevailed. The guilty had received their just punishment, and society could turn this terrible page. But justice is not always the same as truth. And although the case was officially closed, a crucial, agonizing question remained unanswered. We will never know exactly what happened in the last hours of Leo's life in that attic. What words were spoken? What was the final trigger that turned years of cold indifference into active cruelty? Until the very end, throughout the entire trial, Anneliese and Bastian did not provide a consistent, truthful picture of that moment. Each of them drew their own version in which the other was the real monster, and they themselves were only frightened accomplices dragged into someone else's nightmare. Their perfect house in Cariclan, which became the stage for this tragedy, was sold. The new owners will probably never know what lies behind the immaculate walls of their new home. Anneliese page, once a shining showcase of her success, was deleted and dissolved into the digital void, along with thousands of deceitful posts about the joys of motherhood. Their world, which they had so carefully built, collapsed, leaving nothing but ashes and unspoken truth. And although 2 culprits are serving a life sentence, the crucial question, who exactly delivered the fatal blow, remains a mystery. This truth is forever buried with them within the prison walls, just as surely as they once tried to bury their son in the silence of the forest. At 23:47, an emergency call is received by Derry City's emergency services. The line is stable, but the voice on the other end immediately raises an alarm. It's a child's voice. It sounds shaky, but desperately tries to speak clearly. The boy apparently tries to suppress his fear. On the other end of the line, there is only one phrase, but it is terribly disturbing. "Mom, put my sisters to sleep in the water." This is not a typical call. This is not a random problem that any dispatcher can handle. The child's voice conveys not just fright, but something far more serious. Just fright, but something far more serious. The dispatcher, realizing the gravity of the moment, immediately asks a clarifying question. "Where are you?" The answer was not long in coming. The boy gives an address. Scallow Point Farm. It is a remote location situated far beyond the city limits on the coast, where the nearest neighbors are tens of kilometers away. The weather is also unfavorable. Strong winds and rain could severely impede access to this area. The call is logged in the call journal and the situation begins to unfold. Patrol Unit Number 7 is dispatched to the specified address. The dispatcher's screen immediately shows a marker. Scallow Point Farm. No detailed route instructions, just this small farm isolated from the world. It immediately becomes clear time is short, and they need to act quickly. The road the patrol crew has to take will be difficult. Narrow country roads, which are abundant in these parts, do not allow for much speed, and given the rain and strong winds, leaving the city will turn into a real ordeal. The weather is indeed worsening. The wind is intensifying. Rain lashes against the car's windshield and visibility is deteriorating. All of this creates additional difficulties. But this time, even the weather conditions seem secondary compared to what might await the patrol at the scene. Time is running out and tension hangs in the air. Each crew member understands that the faster they arrive, the higher the chance of finding the child safe. The patrol car, navigating dark stretches of road, heads towards the coast. The wind and rain intensify, but they continue their journey nonetheless. Only a few cars, if any, pass through these deserted roads from time to time. The almost complete absence of population in this part of Ireland and the remoteness of the farm make this place particularly vulnerable. As the patrol continues its journey, it becomes clear that Scallow Point Farm is not just a name on a map. It is a place that at that moment will become the epicenter of an event whose consequences are yet to be understood. A parcel of land on the very edge of the coast, secluded, hidden from prying eyes. And now the patrol unit finally approaches this remote area. But no one can yet say what exactly awaits them there beyond those gray walls. No one knew what was happening there. But this place clearly required intervention. Every minute counts. The O'Neill family resides at Scallow Point Farm. It is a small, isolated farm on the very edge of the coast, 5 kilometers from the nearest village. The O'Neill family consists of Signed, who is 32 years old, and 3 children. A son, Finn, who was 8 years old, and 2 daughters, Seisha, 5 years old, and Ethna, 3 years old. The family seemed typical for these parts. Local farmers working the land, trying to survive despite difficult conditions. But there is one important point. Sened's husband, Liam, is absent. He works on an oil rig in the North Sea and is only home a few times a year. This leaves Signed alone with the children, facing daily difficulties and loneliness. The farm barely generates income. Each year, the land becomes less productive and the income from its operation dwindles. Signed desperately tried to cope with the situation, but loneliness and constant financial pressure took their toll. The house is old, long in need of repair. The village of Doulan, the nearest settlement, is 5 kilometers away, and it's not always possible to get there every day. People rarely venture into these parts, and the farm itself is engulfed by the desolate nature. From time to time, it seems that nature itself tightens its grip around this place. As a local elder says, the wind always blows from the ocean there. These are not just words. The wind, cold and strong, seem to always remind them that the farm is a place where man and nature are in constant struggle. And now in this secluded, almost abandoned part of Ireland, the patrol car finally approaches the farm. In the dark night, amidst this wind and rain, the scene before the officer's eyes becomes clear, yet at the same time frightening. A light burns in one window of the house. This is strange. There are no other light sources, only this one, faint and dim. But even more disturbing is that the front door of the house is ajar. It's like an invitation. But to what? What will they enter when that door opens? The officers get out of the car, and before them stands a house that at this moment seems not just an old building, but something far more ominous. Each step brings them closer to an answer. But what exactly that answer will be is yet unclear. The officers enter the bathroom. It is a small, dark room as if imprisoned in this old house. The only light source is a faint flickering light from the corridor. In the center of the room stands an old cast-iron bathtub chipped in with peeling paint. The water in it seems strange. Not just water, but something that shouldn't be there. And then in this water, a terrible discovery. In the cast-iron bathtub lie the bodies of 2 girls, Sasa, 5 years old, and Ethna, 3 years old. Their bodies are motionless, lifeless, and the water around them seems to have absorbed all that remained of their lives. The officers record this with cold precision. Protocol, just a fact. But even behind this simple, impartial description lies a horror that needs no additional words. The water in the bathtub is no longer just water. It is the place where everything ended. Moving to another part of the house, the officers head to the kitchen. There at the table sits O'Neill. She doesn't move. The room is completely silent, broken only by her quiet, monotonous sounds. Her gaze is fixed on one point. She doesn't answer questions. She doesn't answer questions. Doesn't move, doesn't react to those present. Before her on the table lies an empty bottle of Jameson whiskey. This is the first thing that catches the eye. Perhaps this is an explanation. A drunken woman who lost control did something terrible in a fit of despair. But all this is too simple. Reality is much more complex. Zenid offers no resistance when the officers approach and make the arrest. She sits like a statue, not moving, not looking at them. She doesn't resist, doesn't try to escape, doesn't scream. She just sits lost in her own world. Her condition is obvious. She is not herself. The investigative team and the coroner have already been called to the scene. The house is cordoned off. The official procedure begins. Officers secure the crime scene, and the entire scene transforms into the work of investigators, police, and forensic experts. But what exactly happened here? Who and why witnessed this horror? This is just the beginning of a long and complex investigation. Forensic experts begin their examination of the house. This is a standard procedure that looks almost routine. Local specialists record all details to avoid missing any clues. The house is subject to a full inspection in search of traces that could indicate outside interference. The initial check yields nothing unusual. There are no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows are locked. Everything is as it should be if we consider the situation as an accident or a family tragedy. Local experts assert that everything points to the absence of external interference. This is a typical moment in an investigation when cases begin to unfold within the framework of the expected version. When Synod undergoes a medical examination, the results seem obvious. The woman's blood has a high alcohol concentration. This is a logical element that it seems only confirms the version of an accidental tragedy that occurred while intoxicated. A person unable to cope with life gave up and drowned their children in a fit of despair and under the influence of alcohol. It's all so simple. However, when Finn, one of the few remaining witnesses, is interrogated, the picture begins to change. He looks bewildered, his eyes filled with fear. A social worker is present in the room with him to create conditions for an honest and calm conversation. Finn tries to answer questions, but his testimony is rambling. He struggles to find words clearly in a state of severe stress. First, he speaks meaningless phrases. But suddenly, amidst this chaos, his words burst out like something strange and inexplicable. Mom was arguing with Grandma. This phrase is recorded in the protocol. It does not correspond to any version discussed until this moment. Who was this grandmother? Why does Finn mention her in the context of what happened that night? The investigator putting down the documents immediately checks the information. The maternal grandmother, Maeve O'Neill, had been dead for many years. She died in 1978. These facts could change everything, but at first no one pays attention to it. Finn's words are attributed to shock and childish fantasy, nothing more. After all, children often say strange things, especially after traumatic events. But this anomalous detail is recorded in the case, and despite being immediately set aside, it remains an important element of the investigation. We don't know when this detail might play its role, but it will certainly be significant in the future. Senate O'Neill is the sole suspect in this case. After examining the crime scene and analyzing all the gathered facts, her figure became central. She was alone in the house at the time of the incident. Her son Finn became the only witness, and his testimony generally supports the version that the mother could have been directly involved in the tragedy. Her condition at the time of discovery also serves as important evidence. Medical results recorded at the scene confirm that Sinead was intoxicated. The evidence, it would seem, points entirely to her. Everything looks as if she could not be anything but guilty. No signs of forced entry were found in the house. The doors were closed and the windows too. There was no trace that could hint at outside interference. At first glance, everything confirms that she was alone, and this makes her suspect number one. As a result of all this, Sen O'Neill was charged with murder. Judging by the collected facts, there is no other way but to bring this charge against her. The whole picture fits together very logically. A woman in a state of alcoholic intoxication, in a desperate situation, lost control and committed a terrible act. Psychological and physical exhaustion, alcoholism, and a psychological crisis. This seems like a perfectly plausible motive. Finn, as the only witness, was unable to accurately explain all the details of what happened, but his words and testimony confirm the picture of the tragedy. Everything points to her. At the same time, the official version of the motive presented by the investigation appears quite simple and straightforward. The expected version, postpartum depression, which exacerbated by constant isolation and despair, could have led to psychosis. A woman receiving no support, facing constant difficulties and financial problems, was unable to cope with the burden of life. This explained how the tragedy could have occurred. Alcohol became her way to escape reality, to absorb the pain. And at some point in a state of delirium, this terrible mistake could have happened. Additional factors such as social isolation, lack of support, and financial difficulties played their role in this process. According to local residents, Sinead always seemed withdrawn. Neighbors said she was unhappy, that her life was full of difficulties, and all of this, in their eyes, logically connected to the tragedy. In the neighbors' reports, phrases such as, "she was withdrawn," "she always seemed unhappy," are recorded. These words are key moments that fit into the picture of fear and despair that it seemed pushed to the crime. After being charged, Sinead O'Neill was transferred to a hospital in Ennis under strict medical supervision. This is a standard procedure in such cases, but her behavior leaves many questions. She does not interact with investigators or doctors, does not answer questions, and shows no emotion. This silence can be interpreted in different ways. Perhaps it is an admission of guilt, or perhaps an even deeper psychological trauma. In this state, she looks almost like a person who has lost all connection with reality. Her actions or inactions call into question her sanity and force a re-evaluation of the entire picture of what happened. Sinead's silence, her refusal to engage with others, at times seemed to be her only way of interacting with this world. And this silence, which can be interpreted as an admission of guilt, actually creates more questions than answers. It seems she remained in this state unable to comprehend or overcome what happened. Be that as it may, the case is being prepared for referral to court. All information has been gathered, testimonies recorded, and charges filed. At first glance, everything seems quite clear. The investigation is complete, and now only the court can close this case. But even so, there remains an ambiguity that is unsettling. A simple, obvious answer is what makes an investigation seem complete. And although everything looks like a final version, There is a feeling that the case is just beginning. Night. The lead investigator sits in his office rereading the case. He cannot settle down. Everything seems correct, everything as it should be, but something inside him gives him no peace. He rereads testimonies, analyzes every fact, every detail, but still cannot shake a strange feeling. Everything is too simple. His mind is clouded and the protocols contain only dry facts. He notices that the case does not give him full satisfaction. There is no note, no explanation that could logically justify the act. No insurance, no revenge, nothing. All these rational motives are just an empty space. Everything is too easily explained. A woman exhausted by life drank and committed the unimaginable. But something is wrong. Where is this logical flaw? Why did she leave no traces? Why was there no note? Why is everything so smooth? And then the investigator's gaze again falls on Finn O'Neill's testimony. The phrase he uttered still gives no peace. Mom was arguing with Grandma. This makes no sense. Where did this strange moment come from? Why does a child in shock speak of a deceased grandmother? This is not just a childish fantasy. He rereads these words again and again. This strange fragment, which seemed to have been relegated to secondary roles, now seems like a key. It cannot be a coincidence. There is a continuation to this. Suddenly, his intuition awakens and he realizes he needs to check something else. The investigator does not immediately decide, but his hands involuntarily reach for the archive. He finds Maeve O'Neill's death certificate. Suddenly, something clicks in his head. The dates match. Maeve died in 1978. Could this be related? Strange, but perhaps an important detail. Perhaps this anomaly, this unobvious fragment, is the key to solving the mystery. He makes a decision. He cannot stop at this. The investigator understands that he will not simply repeat what the system has set out. He decides to start checking Cyanid's family history. He realizes that if he understands correctly, this entire tragedy may only be part of something much deeper and much older. It may be related not to events of recent months, but to what happened many years ago. The investigator sends an official request to the Clare County Archive. This is a step that officially shifts the investigation into a new direction. He will not simply follow the path that was outlined by the system. He begins to look for connections to the past. The request concerns medical records as well as any other documents relating to Maeve O'Neill and her daughter Isolde O'Neill, Cyanid's mother. This is a step that will open a new chapter in the investigation. Now the case ceases to be simply a crime investigation. It is no longer about what happened in the farmhouse. It is about what happened to Cyanid and her family decades ago. The vector of the investigation has shifted from studying the present to studying the past. And this turn was just the beginning. Sen is in a ward under round-the-clock observation. Every step, every movement is recorded. Medical staff keep notes reflecting her condition, and these notes become an important part of the investigation. At first, nothing unusual, but here is one of the first entries in the nurse's log. Patient refuses food, does not respond to questions. This is strange. Nothing extraordinary, it seems, but in the context of what is happening, it looks like the first signal that something is wrong with her. The entry in the log continues. Long periods of immobility, catatonia. This is already more serious. The doctor and nurses notice that Cyanid remains in one position for hours, as if her body does not obey her will. She does not move, does not speak, as if absorbed in some internal state. This description leaves no doubt. Her behavior is completely abnormal. In her case, it indicates clear signs of pathology, and then Cyanid's condition changes. The diary entry again records changes. Periods of apathy are replaced by bouts of anxiety. These two states are polar opposites, but they come one after another. The woman is in despair, not understanding what is happening to her. All of this is observed against the background of complete refusal to contact others, and an alarming inadequacy appears in her behavior. She becomes unpredictable. But that's not all. The record continues to reveal more disturbing moments. One day, the nurse wrote, "Patient talks to an empty corner of the ward." This is frightening. Sen, it would seem, is conversing with someone who does not exist, It's not just about a parallel reality, but about actual psychosis, and these moments are becoming more frequent. There was no logic in her words. Her gaze was clouded and her voice was quiet and inconspicuous. And now an even more disturbing entry. "Quiet now. It won't hurt you." These words spoken by Cyanid sound like perverted care, as if she is truly convinced that someone needs help. Pain relief, but whom this moment simply casts a shadow on the entire motive. Why does she say this in such a state? Perhaps it is a reflection of her inner struggle. Or does she actually believe that her actions are not a crime but an act of love and protection? The attending physician, carefully monitoring the patient's condition, submits a report on her inappropriate behavior. He understands that this is not just a consequence of alcohol or stress. Sened's behavior is incompatible with simple diagnosis. In the report, the doctor states, "Behavior is incompatible with simulation or simple alcoholic psychosis." This is not a case that can be easily dismissed as ordinary mental health problems. The investigation cannot ignore such conclusions. The entire picture begins to take an unexpected turn. The official recommendation is a full psychiatric examination. Now the question of her mental health becomes central to the investigation. This is not just a case of crime, but a case that may conceal a much deeper and darker story. The investigators arrive at the central archive of the closed St. Bridget's Hospital. This place has long been forgotten, hidden from prying eyes, dark corridors, and an ominous silence. In this vast library where decades of history are stored, every corner seems filled with mystery. Shelves covered in dust are piled high with thousands of folders. These folders are repositories of the fates of many people, many of whom have long faded from memory. Searching here is always a complex and tiring task, but for investigators who are tasked with unraveling the mysteries of the past, every minute spent in the archive matters. They sifted through several sections, finding only random documents. Time drags on slowly. However, after several hours of painstaking searching, finally on one of the shelves, the correct section appears. On the folder, standing among others, is a simple but important word, O'Neill. The investigator's heart skips a beat. This folder is now their chance. He carefully removes it from the shelf. It's not a large folder, only a few pages, but it may contain the solution to the entire investigation. On the cover, the name is visible. Isolde O'Neill. Years of hospitalization, 1971. These dry facts awaken questions that no one had asked before. Why this particular woman? Why these years? How is she connected to Send? The investigator opens the first page of the folder. He feels the tension building. This is a moment where every turn becomes important. He carefully examines the pages, scanning each line, and then his gaze stops on one line in the diagnosis column. It is clearly written by hand. Manic depressive psychosis with acute paranoid episodes. These words turn everything upside down. The diagnosis once given to his soldier O'Neill seems to illuminate so much that had remained hidden. For the first time, after so long, it all falls into place. The entire mystery hidden in Finn's testimony receives documentary confirmation. His words about Mom arguing with Grandma now become not just childish fantasies, but part of a real history. This is not an accident, but a legacy that may have been passed down through generations. The investigator realizes that he is facing not just a family tragedy, but something much deeper. Now he is sure. The case does not end here. Paranoid psychosis like his soldiers and her manic episodes are not just a medical record. They are a key that opens up completely new questions for him. The psychiatrist assigned to conduct the examination begins working with Sened O'Neill. As an experienced specialist, he starts by studying all the case materials, interrogation protocols, nurses' notes, a copy of Isolde O'Neill's medical chart. Within these documents lies something more than just a description of one case. This is not just the story of a woman who lost control. It is a generational story embedded in medical records and notes. The psychiatrist's work, which will last several weeks, will become a key part of the investigation. In late March 1992, an official report will be submitted that could turn everything upside down. The psychiatrist's report begins with a key phrase that sheds light on what is happening. The patient demonstrates signs of severe affective disorder. This is not just a result of observations. It is a diagnosis that opens the doors to understanding her condition. But even more importantly, the psychiatrist continues. There is a high probability of a hereditary nature of the disease. This is no longer a coincidence. The discovery from the archive which spoke of Isolde O'Neill's diagnosis now becomes central. Not only because of the symptoms, but also because this disorder was likely inherited by Sine. The preliminary diagnosis made by the psychiatrist sounds like a definitive point in the medical explanation. Acute psychotic episode against the background of undiagnosed bipolar disorder. These words provide the science behind what happened. This entire psychosis that erupted no longer looks like a random tragedy, but a logical outcome of a hidden mental disorder. But the psychiatrist's conclusion also addresses alcohol, which so often figured in the investigation. At first glance, alcohol was the main catalyst for the tragedy. However, the psychiatrist's report emphasizes a different point. Alcohol in this case acted not as a cause, but as a catalyst, removing the last barriers of mental defense. Alcohol did not create the problem. It merely accelerated and exacerbated an already existing illness. This important clarification radically changes the picture. Alcohol was not the cause. It merely played a role in revealing what was hidden within Sinead. Now the drunken murder theory, which seemed obvious and logical in the initial stages of the investigation, is officially disproven. This was not a spontaneous crime committed while intoxicated. It was a consequence of a long-term mental disorder that lay beneath the surface, and now we are beginning to understand its extent. The expert's conclusion confirms we are facing a much more complex picture. Sinead's condition requires not only medical intervention, but also a new approach to the investigation, which is only just beginning. The investigation is obligated by protocol to check the alibi of the closest relative. In this case, Sinead's husband, Liam O'Neill. This is a standard procedure for such cases, as checking all possible versions is not merely a formality, but a part of the core investigative method. Liam being on an oil rig in the North Sea on the day of the tragedy could have had some influence on the events. However, despite all suspicions, this step was necessary to exclude him from the list of possible participants. Officers send an official request to the operating company of the Brent Alpha oil platform. The request concerns whether Liam O'Neill was on the platform on the day of the incident. This is not just a bureaucratic formality, but a question that could reveal important details. The answer arrives quickly via old-fashioned telex, the technology of those years. It contains timesheets that record Liam O'Neill's workday on February 12, 1992. And most importantly, his name is definitely present on the shift roster. This confirms his presence on the platform on the day of the tragedy. The response also includes a list of 12 employees ready to confirm his presence on the platform. This makes Liam's alibi absolutely ironclad. The question of his possible involvement in the crime automatically disappears. The investigator, having received all the documents and evidence, compiled an official report based on the inspection's findings. The wording in the conclusion is simple and leaves no room for doubt. Liam O'Neill's presence at the crime scene is physically impossible. This report definitively excludes him from the list of suspects. With Liam O'Neill's exclusion, the investigation returns to Sinead. Now, taking into account her condition and the exclusion of the male version, the investigation increasingly focuses on her as the only possible source of the tragedy. Liam O'Neill returns to Ireland on May 10, 1992, several months after the tragedy. His presence in his homeland immediately becomes an important element of the investigation, but now not as a suspect. He is summoned for questioning as a witness, and he readily agrees. Liam has long since grieved his loss, but now his role is to become a source of information about Sinead's past, that hidden history she never shared with others. Now, despite all his sorrow, Liam becomes an important figure in unraveling what happened. During the interrogation, Liam shares what he noticed in his wife's behavior. His words directly point to a problem, but he, like many others, could not realize what was actually happening. She was different in the last year. Sometimes silent for weeks, sometimes crying for no reason. Liam says, these phrases at first glance may seem simply signs of fatigue and stress. However, now that we understand something deeper was happening with Sinead, this description reminds us of the pathology that was gradually building up in her life. But Liam goes further. His words also convey anxiety and a lack of understanding of what was happening in the family. Sometimes she spoke of bad blood in her family. I thought they were just words. I attributed it to fatigue. This revelation is important. It directly indicates that Sinead was aware of a problem in her family. She knew about the mental disorder she inherited from her mother, but could not find the strength to seek help. All these talks about bad blood became part of her internal struggle with the illness. The next important element is provided by Sinead's aunt. A survey of relatives confirms that Isolde's Sinead's mother's illness was not discussed in the family. Isolde's illness was not discussed in the family. It was a disgrace. She says this quote reveals the full tragedy of the situation. Not just illness, but the fear of being rejected and condemned. In a society where mental illnesses were often considered shameful, Sinead preferred to remain silent, hiding her pain so as not to become an object of condemnation. The investigator begins to form a picture, putting all the facts together. Sinead knew about the hereditary risk, but was afraid to confront it directly. Everything she did, including silence and refusing help, was dictated by the fear that she might be declared insane. This fear became the main driver of her behavior, turning her life into a vicious circle from which she could not escape. Of course, her main fear was related to her children. Her whole life revolved around them, and losing her children was the worst-case scenario for her. She feared that her mental state would lead to her children being taken away from her. This was the very fear that ultimately made her act irrationally, leading to the tragic end. The interrogation room in the hospital. This is no longer just a simple gathering. All key figures are sitting in the room. Signed the investigator, her lawyer, and a psychiatrist. The atmosphere is extremely tense. Every word spoken here matters. On the table lies a folder, a copy of Isolde O'Neill's medical record, Sened's mother. This document now stands between them. It is like a symbol of the past that can no longer be hidden. The story Sind had tried to conceal for so long is now coming to light. The investigator places the folder on the table, aims at Sened, and with cold composure asks the question that penetrates the very heart of her fear. We know about your mother's illness. Why did you remain silent? This is not just a question, but psychological pressure, an attempt to make her confess or at least explain herself. She knows this moment is crucial. Sened, for the first time throughout the process, does not remain passive. From the interrogation transcript, the suspect shows a strong emotional reaction for the first time. She flinches, but despite this does not answer immediately. It seems she's about to fall silent again. However, the investigator, not giving her time to catch her breath, asks a second, more crucial question. Finn said, "You spoke with your grandmother. We know your mother suffered from hallucinations. Tell us about it." Hallucinations. Tell us about it. This question closed another loop connecting her psychosis with her mother. Now Sened cannot brush it off. Silence falls in the room. Everyone, including Sened, understands that she is on the verge of making a decision to answer or to continue to be silent. This is a moment of choice that will take the entire investigation to a new level. The silence lasts for several long seconds. Everyone watches her, and finally her silence is broken. Sened begins to speak. Her voice is quiet, barely audible, but words begin to pour out as if she could not stop. It was in their eyes. The same laugh, the voice of the illness. These words sound like an apology, and at the same time an explanation of what was happening to her. It is not just a confession. It is her perception of the enemy that was penetrating her mind. Then she utters what explains her actions. I didn't want them to suffer. I had to save them. Send them to a quiet place. This is a key quote for Sind. What happened was not murder. It was her mission. She was trying to save her children from what she considered an impossible existence, from a life of pain and suffering. She truly believed that her actions were an act of salvation. Now it became clear this was not a spontaneous act of malice or violence. It was a tragic mistake born of a deep mental disorder. Everything she did was the result of her inner world, a world in which she believed she was saving her children. For the final expert assessment, a special medical board of 3 leading psychiatrists in the country was convened. This step was necessary to definitively translate the medical conclusions into a legal framework. The experts were given access to all case materials, including Sened's latest testimony during interrogations. Everything that had been gathered during the investigation was now before them. Documents, analyses, observations, as well as psychological reports. Based on this data, they were to formulate a final conclusion. When the conclusion was ready, it was forwarded to the prosecutor's office. The waiting period became tense as this conclusion could be the decisive factor that would move the case into the legal realm. The experts not only investigated Sind's personality, they studied her mental state to understand whether she could comprehend the consequences of her actions when she committed the tragedy. The document that will now influence Sened's future is titled Conclusion of Forensic Psychiatric Examination in the case of Sened O'Neill. It contains key information. The diagnosis, bipolar affective disorder type 1 with psychotic features. This is a serious mental illness that explains many of her actions. Bipolar disorder and the hallucinations she referred to become clear to the entire system. But the most important part of this conclusion is the expert's final finding, which directly determines Sened's legal fate. At the time of committing the imputed acts, Citizen O'Neill was in a state of insanity and could not comprehend the factual nature and social danger of her actions. This recognition of her insanity leaves no room for doubt. Everything that happened was the result of psychosis, not a conscious crime. The prosecution's reaction to this conclusion was inevitable. After detailed study, The prosecution agreed with the expert's findings. This is not just a confirmation of Sened's mental state. It is a change in the entire judicial perspective. The charge of intentional murder was dropped. Now the court will consider the case not as a crime with deliberate intent, but through the prism of the insanity defense law. Everything changes. The trial, which will begin soon, will not be about guilt, but about the state of mental health. This transformation of the case's significance will take the process to a new level, and the question of her sanity will now be at the center of attention. Protocols of therapeutic sessions with Sen were appended to the case materials. These records provided insight into her inner world and what was happening in her head on the night of the tragedy. The questions the doctor asked were not only directed at her mental state, but also at the nature of her hallucinations. In one session, the doctor asks a direct question. What exactly did the voice tell you? This question, seemingly simple, will reveal another layer of her psychosis. Sened's answer was frightening and strange. It was my grandmother's voice. It said the spoilage was already in them, that they needed to be cleansed. These words completely echoed what she said during the interrogation and what her son Finn had said. But now, in a calmer and deeper setting, she describes it with much greater detail. These are not just fantasies, but memories and experiences she lived with. But Sened's hallucinations were not only auditory. She also describes visual hallucinations, which makes her psychosis even more comprehensive. She recounts how she saw the illness in her own child. When Siobhan laughed, I didn't see her face, but the face of the illness. It was mocking me. This distorted perception of reality was part of her psychosis. The pain and suffering she experienced transformed into these images, into these terrifying visions that prevented her from distinguishing reality from hallucination. Sened recounts how she felt she had to cleanse the children. In her mind, she was not committing a crime. She was simply fulfilling her mission. The water was supposed to wash everything away, to put them to sleep in silence forever. These words became key to understanding her actions. What she perceived as an act of care, we now see as a tragic mistake dictated by psychosis. When the doctor asks the last question, the most direct of all, "Did you want to kill them?" Sened answers with such sincerity that it is unsettling. "No, I wanted to save them." This answer is not just an explanation. It is the final point in understanding her motivation. In her world, in her mind, everything that happened was an act of tragic, distorted love. Her actions, despite their terrifying nature, were dictated by a pathological state. Sened did not realize that her perception of the world was distorted and that she was causing suffering. In her eyes, her act was an act of salvation. Courtroom. Salvation. Courtroom. On the witness stand sits the chief psychiatric expert, ready to give his conclusion. All eyes are on him, for his words will determine the understanding of what happened. He addresses the jury, explaining not just what happened, but how it happened in Sened's mind. His task is to translate all events into a comprehensible language of logic and medicine. This is not just testimony, but an attempt to reveal how a mental disorder led to the tragedy we are now discussing. The expert begins his speech focusing on the most important aspects of her illness that catalyzed the tragedy. He describes how, for several weeks, Sened suffered from insomnia and paranoia. These factors exacerbated her underlying disorder, which of course was always present. But in such a state, it gained strength. Nighttime insomnia and obsessive thoughts became her reality, and this only intensified her inner struggle. The paranoia in her head grew stronger, and she lost the ability to distinguish fear from reality. Next, the expert explains how alcohol became a destructive catalyst. It destroyed the last control mechanisms she still somehow maintained. Alcohol removed the final barriers, and Sened plunged into an acute psychosis that completely altered her perception of the world. This was the moment when she could no longer distinguish what was real and what was a product of her sick mind. At the culminating moment of the psychosis, her perception finally shifted. Auditory and visual hallucinations became an objective reality for her. What was happening in her head was real, and she could not fight this world. Her visions and the voices she heard became inevitable for her, like something she had to obey. This was not just perception. It was a feeling that she had to act to save her children. The expert finally explains the act itself. He states that for her actions were not violence, but a ritual dictated by voices she could not resist. For her, it was not a crime, but a mission. She thought she was helping her children, relieving them of the suffering she believed was inevitable. Everything she did seemed to her an act of salvation, not murder. The scientific explanation has been provided to the court. All key aspects of the psychosis and its consequences are now understood. This picture is complete. February 2nd, 1993. The Supreme Court of Venice. All key participants in the case are gathered in the courtroom. Liam O'Neill, investigators, the press. Sen O'Neill is in a special defendant's box. The atmosphere of the courtroom itself is filled with tension. The trial, which lasted several months, is approaching its climax. All eyes are fixed on the fate of the woman whose actions led to a terrible tragedy. The judge looks up, and in silence, the reading of the verdict begins. First, the judge states the obvious fact. The court has found that signed O'Neill committed actions that led to the deaths of Chauvin and I.E. O'Neill. This is standard procedure to affirm the fact that a crime was committed. But at this point, there is a pause. The tension in the courtroom increases because the next step could change everything. A pause. The judge continues. However, based on the presented evidence and expert assessments, these words become the turning point that will take the case to another level. All the previously gathered information about Senady's condition now sounds like a key part of the decision. The judge concludes, the court finds her not guilty by reason of insanity. The courtroom falls silent. This was not just a verdict. It was a final conclusion that changed the entire course of the investigation. The question of guilt disappears. The question of the defendant's mental state comes to the forefront. Then the judge reads out the order regarding Sen's further fate. Said O'Neill is subject to compulsory treatment at the Central Mental Hospital in Dublin. This is not freedom. It is the beginning of a new stage in her life. A life in which she will receive the medical care necessary for her condition. The trial is concluded, swiftly but firmly. The court renders its verdict. The case is officially closed. Signed O'Neill was transferred to Dublin, where ongoing medical supervision became part of her life. All information about her condition is now confidential. Her story has moved into the medical sphere and outside the hospital walls. No one knows how she lives today. However, she is no longer the woman who stood before the court. Her life continued, but within the framework of the medical system. Liam O'Neill, having survived the nightmare that changed his life, together with his son Finn, decided to start over. In 1993, they sold the farm in County Clare and left that area. This step was not only an escape from the past, but also an attempt to restore some stability to their lives. Their subsequent whereabouts are unknown. Since then, they have disappeared from view, leaving behind a void that will forever remain a mystery to everyone. As for the Scallow Point farm itself, its new owners never came to live there. The house remained abandoned, like a symbol not only of tragedy, but also of a broken life that once existed within those walls. Local residents avoid the place. It has become part of local folklore. A place where a terrible tragedy once occurred, and now it is filled with ghosts of the past. But the O'Neill story did not remain only within the confines of this small village. The case attracted media attention across Ireland, and an active discussion began in the country about mental health issues, especially in rural and conservative communities. The main topic of discussion was how society stigmatizes people with mental illnesses, especially in places like villages where illnesses are often hidden and help is insufficient. The O'Neill family tragedy, despite all its brutality, became a catalyst for change. This case drew attention to a huge problem, the lack of adequate psychiatric care in Ireland. In the mid-1990s, it became one of the key factors that led to the reform of psychological services, which perhaps could have saved many other people from similar tragedies. The story of Sinead, Liam, and their entire family is now no longer just a private tragedy. It is a reminder of the importance of support and understanding of mental illnesses, and how strongly they can affect people's lives.